The wine was already poured when my mother tapped her glass with a butter knife and called for attention. I remember thinking she looked pleased with herself in a way that had nothing to do with gratitude. It was Thanksgiving, and the table was full. Aunts, cousins, my father at the far end pretending to be neutral, my sister and her husband side by side like a united front. My mother smiled at the room, and then she smiled at me. And those were two completely different smiles. To my greatest humiliation, she said, raising her glass, "Here's to Marlo." 31 years old, and still letting her landlord pay for her lifestyle. The table didn't go silent. That would have been easier. Instead it erupted, glasses tipped toward her in solidarity. Someone down the row laughed too loudly, and my brother-in-law Marcus leaned back and announced to no one in particular. My uncle Bert, who I had not spoken to since spring, shook his head at me with that particular expression men wear when they've decided disappointment is wisdom. I stared at my plate. I gave myself exactly 30 seconds to become something other than what they expect. Then I set my fork down, lifted my coat from the back of my chair, and looked at each face around that table long enough to make it mean something. Before February, I said, "Every single one of you will be asking me for something." They laughed. Harder than before, actually. My sister Renata pressed her lips together to hold it in and failed. My father studied the centerpiece. They thought I was performing, the wounded daughter making a dramatic exit that would dissolve by morning when I inevitably called to smooth things over. They did not know what I knew about my grandfather's estate. They did not know what I had spent the last year quietly learning to do. And they did not know, not yet, how completely I was done with the version of myself that returned. I drove home without crying. The crying came later, after I'd taken off my shoes in my small apartment and stood in the kitchen not quite knowing what to do with my hands. It wasn't grief exactly. It was the particular exhaustion of someone who has finally recognized a pattern they've been living inside for years. The cruelty at that table hadn't been spontaneous. It had been practiced. My role as the family's measuring stick for failure, the cautionary tale, the underachiever, the one you pointed at to make everyone else feel calibrated. Thanksgiving had just been the first time I declined to cooperate. The messages started before I reached the bedroom. My mother, then my father, then Renata, then my brother Callum, who had sat in total silence at dinner and apparently felt entitled to play mediator from a safe distance. I left the phone face down and went to bed. By morning there were voicemails. My mother's was offended beneath its surface warmth. My father's redirected blame toward her before pivoting to a general appeal for calm. Renata sounded irritated that I had inconvenienced the holiday. Uncle Bert texted that everyone needed to stop making things bigger than they were. I listened to each message once, then set the phone on the windowsill and went to work. My job title was Institutional Records Manager for a mid-sized regional hospital network. What that meant in practice was that I controlled the documentation infrastructure for compliance audits, credentialing files, patient record transfers, and every digitized archive the system had accumulated over 40 years. It was not glamorous. My family had spent years treating it as a punchline. My mother once introduced me at a party as the one who files things. What they did not understand was that I understood how institutions worked at the level of their paperwork. I knew which records were irreplaceable, which signatures were legally binding, and what happened when documentation chains broke down. That knowledge would matter soon. By Saturday, the family messages had shifted from reaching out to me to fragmenting among themselves. Renata texted that our mother was blaming Marcus for making the joke land wrong. Callum reported that Dad had called our uncle's behavior embarrassing. My mother texted me separately to note that some people at that table had no filter. Without me there to absorb it, whatever cruelty normally cycled through the room had turned on itself. That was the first lesson I had not expected. When you remove the designated target, the meanness has nowhere coherent to land. My closest friend, Dora Vasquez, arrived on the second Saturday of December, with tamales she'd made herself and the kind of listening that doesn't require you to explain everything from the beginning. She worked in community legal aid, and had a gift for identifying when a situation had moved from bad to structurally unsound. She looked at me across my kitchen table and asked the question my family had never once asked. What do you actually want from this? Not what was fair. Not what would restore harmony. What did I want? I told her the truth. I wanted one gathering in my adult life where I was not the object lesson. She nodded like this was self-evident and said, "So build one." I started that night. I requested additional project hours through January. I submitted a formal application for the senior compliance director role that had been open for 2 months. I began drafting documentation on a records digitization initiative I'd been circling for a year without committing. And on a Thursday afternoon, while reviewing credentialing files, I received a call from an attorney named Patricia Hale, who represented the estate of my grandfather Raymond Osei. My grandfather had died in the early fall. While the family attended the service and negotiated over his possessions, I had spent the better part of the previous 2 years helping him organize and digitize the business records of a commercial property he'd owned for decades, a mid-size office building in the city's historic district, currently leased to 4 tenants. He used to say I was the only one who understood that old things had weight. Patricia Hale told me there was an estate matter requiring my presence. Not the family's. Mine specifically. Have you ever stood very still in a fluorescent-lit office hallway and understood that your life is about to change shape? The estate meeting took place in a conference room that smelled of carpet cleaner and constraint. My mother arrived first and looked genuinely thrown when I walked in. My father's jaw set. Marcus wore the expression of a man calculating odds. Uncle Bert muttered something that suggested he found my attendance presumptuous. My grandfather's estate had distributed most personal effects months earlier. What remained was the commercial building, currently generating stable rental income. Recently appraised at a figure that made the room very quiet, along with a reserve account and a set of business records, Patricia described as having significant historical valuation. The building had been placed in a trust before my grandfather's death. The trustee was me. My father laughed once, briefly, the way people laugh at a mistake they assume will be corrected momentarily. Marcus said there must have been an error. There was no error. Patricia explained that the trust generated income. She explained that the asset had appreciated considerably. She explained that distributions from the reserve account were at the sole discretion of the trustee. There were no automatic disbursements to any family member. None. That was the moment I understood how much debt had been quietly accumulating around me. My father's events company had overextended through the summer. Renata and Marcus's boutique was carrying a delinquent business loan. Uncle Bert had borrowed against collateral he'd partially sold. They had not spent 6 weeks calling me because they felt badly about Thanksgiving. They had been calling because they had been counting on my grandfather's property to solve problems they had not yet admitted aloud. Patricia passed me a sealed envelope. My grandfather had left me a letter. I took it home and read it at my kitchen table with cold tea, and the window cracked. He wrote in the careful, deliberate handwriting of someone who chose words the way you'd choose tools, only the necessary ones. He wrote that he had watched the family dynamics for years with more clarity than anyone had credited him. He wrote that every extended family produces one person assigned to absorb the discomfort that others generate, and that he was sorry he had not interrupted that pattern sooner. He wrote that I had been sharpened by being underestimated, but that being sharpened was not the same as being uninjured, and he hoped this gift would purchase some time and some quiet. Then he wrote, "You are under no obligation to rescue people who would not have rescued your dignity." I did not cry immediately. Then I did for a long time, because someone had finally said the plain thing plainly. The calls came in waves after that. My father 3 times before noon. My mother leaving voicemails that blurred at the edges where her composure gave out. Renata, clipped and urgent. Marcus, who had never contacted me directly, suddenly treating me like a business contact he'd neglected. Uncle Bert leaving one furious message about power corrupting, which was a remarkable posture from someone actively requesting financial rescue. Renata was the first to understand that voicemails were not going to move me. She texted one sentence, "Please just meet me." We met at a cafe between our neighborhoods on a gray Tuesday. She looked like someone who had not been sleeping well and had compensated with careful grooming that didn't quite hold. We ordered coffee. She stared into it for a while. She apologized. I waited. She apologized more specifically, and I waited longer. And then she told me the truth that she had laughed at my mother's toast because when our mother aimed her attention at someone else, the only safe position was proximity to her. That Marcus had been antagonistic at Thanksgiving because he was frightened about the loan and had needed somewhere to put that fear. That our mother had been drinking before the guests arrived. Then, twisting a paper napkin into pieces, Renata admitted that our mother had told her to come. That if Renata didn't repair things with me, she shouldn't expect support when the boutique failed. I asked her one question. If I weren't the trustee, would any of this be happening? She was quiet for long enough to answer without speaking. Then she said softly, "Not like this." That stung more than the original toast. Not because it surprised me, but because hearing it removed the last version of the story I'd been protecting. 3 days before Christmas, I accepted an invitation to meet at my parents' house. I set the terms in advance: daytime, no alcohol, no additional guests, and Patricia Hale copied on any discussion involving the estate. My father responded with a thumbs-up emoji, which told me something about his relationship to accountability. The meeting went the way such meetings go when people have not yet decided to be honest but are also not able to continue pretending. My mother cried immediately. My father made sweeping, passive statements about feelings and misunderstandings. Renata sat with her hands folded. Callum was there, pale and saying little, which was at least consistent. I let the vague language float for 15 minutes. Then I asked them to say specifically what had happened at Thanksgiving. Not approximately. Specifically. My mother whispered the toast back to me. My father stared at the floor and repeated what he had added. Renata said what Marcus had said about their children. Callum said he should have spoken and hadn't, which was the first sentence in the afternoon that sounded like a real person. When my father finally asked what I intended to do with the building, I took out the copy of my grandfather's letter I had brought for exactly this moment, and I read aloud the sentence that mattered. Then I told them what I had decided. The trust would remain intact. The income would be managed responsibly. No disbursements would be made to family members, now or in the foreseeable future. A portion of the reserve income would eventually fund a preservation grant in my grandfather's name, supporting apprentice training in historical documentation work, something he would have recognized as meaningful. My mother said that if I cut them off this way, she didn't know what she had left to hold on to. The old version of me would have collapsed under that. Instead, I told her there was a difference between celebrating together and performing togetherness, and that perhaps this was the year to learn which one she actually wanted. I gave them the only terms I was willing to offer. No jokes about my finances, my work, or my choices. No deploying my discomfort as a social lubricant at gatherings. No treating my objections as sensitivity disorders. If it happened again, I would leave without negotiation. Nicole nodded. Callum nodded. My father said nothing. My mother asked me not to go. I told her I was already gone from the version of the family that needed me to stay diminished, and that everything after this was their choice. Christmas Eve, I stayed home. I made pasta, burned the first round of bread, sat on my floor in thick socks watching the small lit tree I'd assembled on a folding table by the window. It was not a beautiful holiday. It was a quiet one, and I had finally learned that quiet was not the same as absence. Sometime after 8, my mother sent a message that didn't ask for anything. She wrote that she understood, looking back, that she had raised me to accept less consideration than I was owed, and that she was ashamed of that. My father sent a separate message acknowledging that they had mistaken hardness for honesty, and that he didn't know when it had become the family's default, only that it had. Were those messages enough? No. Not close. But they were truer than anything that had come before them, and truth, even late and incomplete, is a different category of thing than performance. In January, I accepted the director position. I signed the preservation grant documents. I kept writing. Some people are taught very early and very thoroughly that love is the thing you earn by remaining useful and undemanding. Unlearning that doesn't feel like freedom at first. It feels like grief, because you're not just losing a set of relationships, you're losing the story you told yourself about who those people were going to eventually become. I'm not asking whether you would have forgiven faster or held out longer. I'm asking something quieter. When the people who shaped you finally need something only you can give, do you recognize the difference between reconciliation and leverage, and do you know which one you deserve?